if there was anything that was said that kind of surprised you, or that you'd like to ask a question about, or that you might want to make a comment on. So I'll let anyone who wants to start.
I got one. So when it comes to regionalization, how do we make sure that we're regionalizing the good, but not continuing the pattern of just shipping our waste across state borders and allowing landfills to take the waste from the state? They seem like both great points, but they seem like, how do you regionalize one thing and not the other?
So I'm not totally clear on what the actual question is, but so if I'm hearing you correctly, regionaling one but not the other, regionaling recycling and not waste, or vice versa?
Yeah, as an attorney, I asked a question that was not one of them. So I gotta remember I'm not we're trying to do something.
Yeah, no, I think that sometimes they go hand in hand. In our case, most of our member community, we have 53 member communities. Most of them participate for recycling and solid waste management, and certainly education services. But we do have some that just are recycling only, and we do have some, believe it or not, that are just waste only. It's not as ideal. We try to provide a package. But quite frankly, our focus is more on the recycling side because we have more room to grow. And so we actually are trying to recruit recycling members as opposed to trash members, waste members, because we're near capacity on the waste side.
I'd love to comment on that. This is gonna... All right, so I think one of the interesting questions about that is regionalization. We talk about it in terms of hub and spoke because we know that communities are small and it's really hard to get the critical mass. You're thinking, when I said it'd be, it's almost time for everyone to be able to add polypropylene to their stream. I'm sure a lot of people were like, shh, like I'm gonna be able to store up an entire tractor load of yogurt cups anytime soon. And what the challenge is that everyone is very small. So when I hear regionalization, what I hear is, how do we use the power of the masses? How do we help leverage all these small towns together to have the power of a big town and the economic return of that? And I think that that's a good thing, and we should absolutely do that sort of regionalization effort. But I also think this is what I mentioned in the talk about change. I really think we need to flip that. I am not sure why it's on the backs of every town to have to deal with this in the first place. And so I think that as we work towards regionalization, I agree with Kevin that that's an important tactic for delivering those short-term solutions so that your day-to-day gets easier. But I think we also need to flip around the question of what does a good system look like and how do we approach that system?
So here's a route that I had, Keefe. So one of the things, that you just pointed out was, when I look at readily recyclable, we have good infrastructure for PET and for high density. And the 3 through 7 mix has always been problematic. It has low value. And if I separate those 3 through 7s, to your point, it takes me a year or more to get, a polypropylene container, a load of polypropylene. It doesn't make it, to me, it doesn't make any sense to ship, 4 bales at a time or 5 bales at a time. There's an inefficiency that goes with that. Why not focus on those items that the infrastructure is there to accommodate, and the demand is huge for, just like, for example, PET and high density.
Yeah, so I don't think we should stop high density and PET collection. So 1s and 2s, right? What I think is that what we see nationally is when communities pull out just a number 5 polypro bale, they're actually making money on that bale. When they're marketing 3 through 7s because they want to tell their public, we'll find a solution for everything else. We want bottles and jugs and everything else. That everything else degrades the value of that entire bale. So our organization has been working really hard to increase the national access to Keefe to polypropylene number 5 recycling, because there are such strong end markets that turn it back into packaging, but also the automotive industry is a huge eater-upper of recycled content polypropylene. So I don't think it's an either or, but I do think it's really important to look at how are we doing? And so actually tomorrow I'm headed to a national conference with global executives who are touting their ability to make promises to end waste. They're not saying they're making promises to make less. What they're saying is they want permission to make as much as they make and to end the waste portion of it. And I think that there's a challenge of that. So one of the things that I'm going to say tomorrow is we need to get really serious about the data. What does the data tell us about what is in the household and what is being recovered? And we see a lot of material in addition to those traditional 1 and 2 bottles. But we know that 3/4 of all PET bottles in the household nationally end up in the trash. 2/3 of all HDPE in the household end up in the trash. Nearly all of the polypropylene right now, and that's why we're working on that. But it's not just a plastics problem. 2/3 of all mixed paper, trash. 3 out of 5 cardboard boxes, trash. What happens when paper ends up in a landfill? It makes methane. Methane is our biggest contributor to greenhouse gases. And so I think we need to, again, we can spend a lot of time saying, I only have so much energy, should I do A or B? I'm saying I recognize how everyone is so strapped. And I think we need a policy solution that helps us build consistency so that we hold accountable what's produced in the first place. So only things that are produced are then matched with the system of how they get reused or recycled at the end. So I don't think it's a rub, Kevin. I'm right there with you. We're saying, like, why in the heck do I start working on something new when we haven't reached it on the rest of it yet? I agree, but I think we all need help to be able to do that on a bigger scale way.
So that actually goes right into my next question, which is about policy, right? Policy is something you all talked about. And I think one of the challenges is every state's doing something different. We don't have a lot of consistency, even, among New Hampshire and its bordering states, which is most of the people represented here. We've got a lot of different policies. So my question for you all is, especially in a really politically divided climate, what in your experience are some of the policies that can get bipartisan support in a purple state like New Hampshire that can actually help us affect positive change for solid waste recycling?
Shall I start with pass the weighted thing? So with Colorado passing EPR last week, what we see are there are now 3 states with extended producer responsibility bills. That means if you make and sell something in a state like Maine, Oregon, or Colorado, you are required to pay in a fee to be able to have a better system. And Colorado's recycling rates are in like the 15%, even though it's a green state. It's a big state with a lot of small towns, and they have a lot of trouble marketing things. So I feel like that's a really important next state in the EPR approach because it has purple reflections in it. And we are seeing stronger bipartisan support for producer responsibilities for a big reason. We are seeing more companies behind it than ever before. Our organization has been working very hard with the companies that I mentioned earlier, but Dr. Pepper, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Danone, companies who are making things that you see in your recycling bin say, all right, guys, you've made some big goals. Now let's figure out what it's going to cost you to deliver that if you just keep paying into little grant programs or doing exercises. And then is that going to get us there? So we wrote a report on what would it take to fix the US recycling system. And we define fixing the US recycling system as having 3 parts. 1, everyone can recycle. Right now, 40 million US families do not have access. 2, everyone does recycle. I heard education. Kevin did a great job talking about the role of engaging the public. They're confused, they're frustrated, they're tired, they're distracted. So everyone can, everyone does, and now we've got an infrastructure that reflects not just what has traditionally been recyclable, but this circular economy. That means that we're designing for a system where everything can have that second purpose. The answer, the price tag on that is $17 billion. It would take $17 billion to create that outcome. and we could have a $30 billion return on that within a decade. That's an investment that I don't know, we can't afford not to make that. And that's the conversation we're having with policymakers. So when, I'll pass the mic here, but I think we as recyclers often get into like, are you for or against deposits, or are you for or against pay as you throw? I don't know if that really helps us to look for like thumbs up, thumbs down on these silver bullet ideas. Instead, what I think we should be saying is, how do we use this interest that we have from policymakers, from corporate America, from the public who's tired, and say, how do we build a better system? And I'm interested in how we have yes and policy, the role of deposits and EPR to deliver the system that we need, for example.
I'm definitely going to jump on the EPR bandwagon. It's just, it makes sense. It's the financial calculus that I think will make sense for a state like New Hampshire, because not only are you going to get the money off the backs of towns and cities who are paying for something right now that they have very little control over. They have no control over how these products are designed, whether it's going to be recyclable or not. A little town in New Hampshire really doesn't have any input in both the front end, how it's designed, and what that end market looks like. So by putting the money in and making the producers responsible, I think that's one thing that will get people excited in New Hampshire. And two, when you have EPR systems, you're not just talking about generating money and using it for something. You're making sure it's going into the needs of your existing recycling system. You do a needs assessment at the beginning that says, what are we lacking? Is it a MRF? Is it more education? How do we figure out what is going to make recycling better holistically for New Hampshire? And now we have the money and funds to actually achieve that. So I think that makes a lot of sense for New Hampshire. And then food waste is another thing that just makes financial sense. In Vermont, they've been having the system for 2 years where food waste is banned holistically across the board. It's gotten to the point where it's cheaper to compost because there's enough infrastructure. You're talking about savings of maybe $40, $50 per ton for each town if you have your own composting infrastructure rather than just throwing everything in a landfill. And a lot of that is because they only have one landfill and they're being very protective of that capacity. And that brings me to the third thing New Hampshire needs to do. They are seriously lagging behind their neighbors when it comes to making sure that they're being protected from the influx of out-of-state waste. New Hampshire is the landfill capital of New England. There are constantly efforts to expand existing landfills and build new ones. And most of that is to deal with waste that's not being produced in New Hampshire. So you're paying all this money to have these new facilities built. You're going to deal with the remediation if it's a landfill, because that will eventually leak. So you need to look at policies that will better protect the state of New Hampshire. Vermont has a great policy which makes sure that their landfill is only getting filled with residential waste from Vermonters. Maine has a good system where they ban the construction of new commercial landfills. They can only be state-owned, which gives them greater control about what out-of-state waste is coming in and what isn't. So I think those are three things that really would get the New Hampshire legislature excited.
As I mentioned in my remarks earlier, I think the priority should be on landfill fees. If you collect that money on the landfill side, let's say $10 a ton, the revenue generated from that kind of funding would be significant enough to support those higher rungs of the hierarchy. Think about if you could provide, if the state could provide you with matching funds for everything that you diverted outside the landfill. You could come up with some pretty creative ways to decrease the amount of waste that's ending up in a landfill. So we in the state of Maine are really focused on landfill fees. It's controversial, obviously, but I think that's the best way. It's got to hit the pocketbook. Somehow, some way, it does have to hit the pocketbook.
I wonder whose pocketbook too. I think landfill disposal fees are very important because landfill fees have not changed in 30 years. Like across the country, landfills have held pretty steady, and communities, when what we're seeing nationwide is that average landfill fees are somewhere around $38 a ton on average, and average MRF costs are above $80 a ton. So when communities are saying, and this varies outside of New Hampshire, obviously landfills are more expensive in Massachusetts, for example, but these are national numbers. And when communities are really pressed with, wait a minute, if I have to run my truck anyway, and I'm going to pay double to bring it to the front door of the MRF. When communities are pressed in the time of like a pandemic, when dollars are short, how how do we expect them to make that choice? So I like the idea of how do we use landfill disposal to make sure that we are paying for recycling, but I want to make sure that we're not doing it just on the backs of taxpayers, but that we're thinking about that system and the responsibility of the producer too. So Kevin, I think this is another example of, we could fight thumbs up, thumbs down as in a silver bullet. And really what we're saying is, you know, freaking better system that makes it advantageous for all of us who are working so hard. I get passionate.
So, questions. What questions do you all have? Let's get started.
Good afternoon. This is for any one of you, but particularly with regard to Kevin's remarks, about regionalization. First of all, regionalization has many definitions. It's either small or large or whatever component you want to put in there. But I thought I heard you say something about maybe something in the range of like 6 towns coming together. And I like that idea, and I'll say why. Particularly here in New Hampshire, but it's probably true elsewhere too. We're very proud here in New Hampshire that we have 235 cities and towns that do things their way. To me, that gives all the advantage to the hauling companies to contract as they will to get what I can get from you, and from anybody else around here. For hauling fees and collection or whatever it is. That puts towns at a disadvantage because I'm paying this while they're paying more, they're paying less. And it's how your town individually negotiates that contract. Doing a regionalization type approach with maybe 6 towns together, that puts the ball in the town's court, I believe. Because now you have, which is what the purpose of the NRRA is now you have volume at your fingertips. And all those 6 towns or however will get the same contract. The other thing about that is that right now I can live in my town, which recycles this commodity. The town next to me doesn't. The town over there recycles something that we don't. As people move, they're confused. Well, I used to be able to do this, and now I got to do this over here, or whatever it is. Regionalization again brings uniformity to those people. So we're not spending so much on education on individual town basis. It's more of a collective education that everybody gets the same message again, which is really the identity of the NRRA is that. Have the same message, but our town system don't allow us really to do that. And we struggle as new people come in and out of towns, and I'm retired now, and Kevin knows me because my recycling from Hampton used to go there, and I really enjoyed that relationship. But as people come in, even seasonal people, what's happens in this town doesn't happen in that town or the town that they live in. And we need to have some uniformity in that. To give, again, the power of negotiation. That it's my dollar. I'm paying a hauling company to do a job for me. Why don't I have the power to tell them how to do it? When now it's like, okay, well, if this is what you want, this is what we're going to charge you. If this is what you want, this is what we're going to charge you. And then it's even, well, things have changed. We can't do that anymore. They have the power. And I just like to hear what you all have to say about that.
Thanks for the question, and I couldn't agree more. Again, this is my 3rd try at regionalizing collection in our member community. So I've had 2 failures. And I think I blame the failures basically, as I mentioned in my remarks, that as long as the towns were getting a lower than inflationary increase on their solid waste services, they just assumed do it the way that they were doing it. They had full control. There really was no need to change the way they were doing things. I think this time around, because we're seeing towns that are having double-digit increases in their hauling contracts. And for those that are doing manual collection with somebody slinging the bags, it's even steeper than that. at least automated collection is neutralizing those increases to some extent. But I think we have traction this time around. I'm excited. We'll see how this plays out. But this time we're doing it a little differently. We're starting with a memorandum of understanding because I was the salesman on this effort the last 2 times around, and I was trying to convince the councils to go this direction. Didn't work. So now we're basically saying, hey, look, we're looking for a regional approach. Sign this memorandum of understanding that you're committed to doing this. And if you're not interested, then it's fine. We'll find another town. So the MOU, I think, is going to work in our favor. And hopefully we'll have regional collection in place in 2 years.
All right, next question.
Thank you. So I'm a member of the Upper Valley, and we send all of our waste to Bethlehem. And while I recognize that landfilling isn't the solution, very difficult for us to come up with a short-term solution in 2026 when our contract is up with Bethlehem and something isn't out there for us. Right now, I've got, I represent 2 towns, the town of Sunapee, town of Springfield. We've got a tipping fee that's somewhere about $55 a ton, which is fairly cheap in the state of New Hampshire. I've seen tipping fees that are much higher. And I'm fortunate that I haul my own solid waste and C&D and recyclables for that matter to the various places that I need to. So our operational costs aren't that significant. However, when that 2026 time period happens, I'm going to be left with only a few options to turn around and get an increased tipping fee, as are very many of the folks in the Upper Valley area that do send their waste to. While I appreciate that there has to be a better solution to landfilling, what are your short-term solutions for something like this? And what are your long-term solutions for something like this? Because I think that there's many of us that feel the same way.
That's a terrific question. Thank you. Short term is what we need to focus on immediately. And I think the good news is that decision I talked about coming from the Waste Management Council in New Hampshire last week says that short term, there is no capacity issue in New Hampshire. There's plenty of capacity. We just said Mount Carver expanded. Waste management has a significant amount of capacity. The problem is it's getting filled with waste that's not generated in New Hampshire. It's getting hauled in from out of state. So we short term need to address that. New Hampshire needs to look at ways to seriously start planning and getting a hold of its waste management system. I mean, we're talking about a state that hasn't updated their solid waste management plan since I was 10. We have a new plan coming out in October that was passed by legislation. So we need to get planning in place so we can figure these things out and not continue this system where it's, okay, we have 4 years, what are we going to do? Because it's going to continue on that treadmill where the waste companies are going to be able to say, oh, it's looming, let's not change anything, it's just looming. We have to focus on the here and now. So we do need to start addressing that, but we have to start planning. So that's the first thing. I'm really excited about this plan that's going to come out. It's hopefully going to address a lot of those concerns. And then in the long term, we need to start looking at policy. We need to get things passed so that you can actually have the infrastructure to say, if not landfilling, then what? And that's what Maine's been able to do with EPR. They're going to fix their recycling system and make sure that there's actually readily recyclable material going to the right end markets. And Vermont has been able to do by saying, let's get 40% of the waste going to compost. So it's tough in New Hampshire, it definitely is, but we can't continue this treadmill. It's just not going to yield any results, nothing's going to change. So I hope that answered your question.
To expand on the bigger picture of when could we start to anticipate needing fewer landfills in the world? Because we're not there yet as far as I can see as a realist. Like, I like to torture my children when we travel by playing spot the landfill, and I think it's fun. My teenagers don't, but it helps you get an understanding of what's out there. And so this group might be interested in, I told you that we work with these big companies, and one of the things that we spend a concept that we have that we spend a lot of time on is insist and assist. When a company makes a big pledge, I'm going to recycle 1 for 1 of everything that I make, it's our job to hold them accountable, but to help. And so we don't just hold them accountable through, you know, a campaign or a lawsuit. We step in and say, great, you've made that pledge, now let's work side by side to make sure that you deliver it in a measurable, incredible way. And so some of the things that we've launched this year alone include a national database that uses AI technology to track every recycling program in this country. Anyone know how many there are in this country? Want to guess? Yes, you do. 3,700 is a great start, times almost 3. There are 9,000 individual recycling programs in this country. Some states, or some counties, some municipal, but 9,000 individual ones. And by being able to track them, we're also be able to make tools like working with big data so that Apple and Google and Amazon can help everyone understand what's recyclable where you are. So we're starting to like build up enough information that we're not just giving the public what they need. We're starting to hold accountable companies on what they produce. And what we're building is we're also measuring what's recyclable in the country. We're building tools on how do you help companies design for what is truly recyclable. And what we're doing is removing the gray space from, yeah, it's recyclable some places, check locally. We're really getting to this accountability of the truth of, if you design a package X way, it is or is not recyclable in that place. So Shanna is from Walpole, and I brought my recycling there on Thursday, and she handed me this Arizona tea container that has a 5 and a 7 on the bottom, and I have no idea what it means. And so what I thought is, man, I wish someone designed a tool that said, Arizona tea, there's no reason why you can produce something that's so ambiguous as this. And then I was like, oh, we just did. So this is really important for you guys to know, is that as a nonprofit, we are delivering things like this because they did not exist, and that ambiguity means it's on you to figure out, well, what am I going to do with my stuff? You know, then we get into this fight about should we have landfills or not. I want your help in leveling up this conversation in a bigger way to say, should that be produced in the first place or not? And so that, again, your job is getting easier. So that's landfills, and then up a click.
Quick question for Peter. You talked about the success of blocking the expansion of landfill in New Hampshire because New Hampshire doesn't need the capacity that's being used by out-of-state interests, particularly Massachusetts. Based on that theory, I guess I'm wondering how Conservation Law Foundation also opposed expansions in Southbridge, expansions in Saugus that would have helped Massachusetts stay autonomous in terms of its solid waste needs. So it wasn't burdening other states with export. And it seems somewhere there's a disconnect in that, because unless there's significant effort in the reducing of the trash, it's going to have to go somewhere. And as I will pose to anyone proposing the idea of zero waste, I don't see any of you on a Black Friday blocking a Walmart. I see all of you standing in front of a landfill permit expansion or a solid waste expansion meeting talking about not responsible for managing the trash after it's produced. And I guess I find that concerning every time I hear it brought up. So I'd like to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. As I said during my lunchtime talk, I agree that there, in a lot of instances in the environmental community, is this focus on let's just oppose and not think of solutions. And I think I spent more time talking about solutions than I did opposing during that conversation. So things like extended producer responsibility, food waste diversion, these are the things that we're going to use instead of landfilling. So that's the first part of how to address your question. The second part is, when you build these facilities that can accept out-of-state waste, the problem you're creating is you're undermining reduction efforts. So for instance, Maine has passed a law that says no new commercial landfills. We're going to have a state-owned landfill, we can control what's going in it, have control of our capacity, get a good idea of how much we're producing, make sure we're meeting our reduction goals. Then Massachusetts bans all construction and demolition debris from its landfills. What do they decide to do? Ideally, you would think, let's really reduce this. The goal of this ban is to make sure that we're not going to just pass it on somewhere else. We're going to figure out how to recycle and manage this waste. But when you're allowed to shed things to different places, all of that ended up in Maine systems. There was a loophole. So we tried to close that loophole, and we're successful this year so that we can focus on where you're generating it. Let's actually reduce it. So we really are trying to make sure that there are programs that can reduce the amount of waste Zero waste is a goal. It is a vision that we want to achieve, but there are a lot of steps we need to take in between, and that's where the policy comes in. That's where making sure that the bans we have are actually acting as bans, and you're not putting something off to another community. So we're working tirelessly on those solutions. I am so very thankful that there's only one legislative session that I'm responsible for. It ends in the end of this year. It was a, very interesting time this year. So we are really trying to work on those reductions.
Other questions?
My name is Dave Murphy. I've been a solid waste professional engineer for almost 40 years. Very passionate, promoting recycling and every other possible technology that we can use to try to minimize our waste, including landfills, resource recovery facilities, gasification, composting, AD. That said, the southern states in New England seem to be relying on a policy right now of ship it out of state. And that's state policy now. We've removed any language, southern states have removed language and made it school state responsible. And now we're shipping it to facilities out of state. Now we throw the EJ lens on and we're shipping it to core out of state facilities where we have huge EJ populations all around. So we're physically moving our waste out of our own states where we're not responsible for it anymore into very poor EJ communities. My question to the three panelists are, one, is that something that you would promote? And I guess the second question would be, do you suggest that each state should be responsible for its own waste?
I guess, we need, the bottom line is we need landfills. We're not going to get to zero waste at least in my lifetime. But I think it's something to strive for. So a lot of people will criticize me saying I'm anti-landfill. We actually own and operate a landfill. I'm not anti-landfill. I'm just trying to conserve the space in our landfill for as long a period of time as we possibly can. And sometimes, we throw the waste community, the waste hauling business in particular, or the landfills operators under the bus, and that's probably not always fair. But they do make profits, and that's why we need governmental intervention in this business, because there is a profit motive of filling up a landfill as quickly as possible. That has to be controlled, and so that's a problem. So I go back to my more simplistic view on controlling waste, and that is you've got to do it by a fee. I mean, I would encourage the state of New Hampshire, if this waste is going to come into your state, you might as well get some money for it. If it's going to be stored in your state for 100 years or more. And so if you put the right fees in place, and you'll quickly understand what your fee has to be, then you'll have the finances to help your own program basically lift it up to the higher rungs of the hierarchy. So I would argue that I think it's very difficult to ban, the interstate, or really challenge the interstate commerce clause and try to limit what's being crossed our borders. I think it's much more easily done financially and will benefit your programs and will have the same outcome at the end of the day.
Now I'm going to respectfully disagree with two things. Maybe it's because I'm a little younger, but I'm hoping that we don't see landfills in my lifetime. But I do think it should be the responsibility of each state to manage their own waste. And I think that keeps it in your borders and you're responsible for it. You can actually track how much waste you're creating and see if you're meeting your reduction goals. Now, there may be some needs to have some type of reachable hub, but I do think it's pretty straightforward to get outside of this interstate commerce clause issue. You can do the approach, which is make sure that you have publicly owned landfills, because then you're operating as a market participant. You are therefore allowed more control over what comes in and out of your landfill, and that's the system Maine has created. Or you can do what Vermont has done, which is don't discriminate against interstate commerce, but say, here are our reduction goals. Here's how we want our waste to be managed, because we are trying to secure the capacity of this landfill. Every single municipality, whether you're in state or out of state, needs to submit a plan showing that you comply with our state plan, that you're reducing your waste first and foremost, that you're meeting our recycling goals. So that creates more of an onus on the town where the waste is being produced. And that's when you also integrate things like extended producer responsibility, the policies I was talking about, where you create the ways to divert it into different avenues. So I think until we really get a hold of this, Senator Rick Bennett said in Maine, we're closing out state waste, this, waste colonialism that the southern states are doing to the north, it's gonna be really hard to figure out how we reduce this waste, because it's just a game of where is it cheaper to ship it to, and these companies will see that there are dollar signs if you build this hole.
I have to do some thinking. I've never been asked to answer the question of cross-state, so I'd have to really do some thinking, but I spent much of my life living in the South. And there's completely, and working in solid waste while I was down there, and the acceptance of material. But I guess where my head goes to is, what if we did the math on the true cost of trash instead of, are the landfills currently a revenue generator, and finding the fight of should they be or should they not be, and what is the true cost of trash? I think about the greenhouse gas impact of landfills, and there's more research being done to really hold accountable landfills in their methane production. I think about the human impact, and I'm glad you brought up, EJ, environmental justice, of who is supposed to impact it. Because recycling is not skirt free and clear away from the EJ component of solid waste management. It's not just a landfill issue, and we have to think about that. In our country, that means where are facilities sited. In other countries, that could mean, is there any solid waste situation at all? And then the third thing I think of the true cost of health is like any life cycle analysis on, what's a better material to package in, what has the lowest life cycle analysis. None of them take into effect whale health. None of them think about that. And I think we just really need to have a bigger conversation about the true cost of this. And in 2 weeks, I'm headed to Stockholm. We're an accredited organization of the UN Global Plastics Treaty. And what I'm going to talk about is what is the role of blended finance to make sure that we're building stronger systems so that it's not, 3 folks on a stage saying, should we or shouldn't we have landfills, that we're actually talking about how do we shift from a linear economy where it's okay to make to waste, and instead shift to a circular economy where from the very concept of something being designed, whether it's going to be an irritant to the environment or not. And so I think that when I said earlier about the change that's happening, we're in a change moment. And I hope you use your collective voices to say, enough, I don't want to sit in another session where 2 guys fight about should there be landfills. I want to spend my time doing something else. But y'all are nice. There's one in the back there.
And we purposely invited you 3 to make it interesting, so thank you.
I have to say, sometimes there's panels where they don't disagree, but they're like, excellent point. And I'm glad that we're not that.
Thanks. Circling back to the concept of regionalization, is there any reason why New England as a whole, all 6 states, are not addressing regionalization together for landfill capacity and where to put the waste as a region? Why is regionalization simply addressing 6 towns in the Lakes area, for example? So is there anybody working on the bigger picture of regionalizing solid waste disposal, all New England states together?
Well, NRRA is like a regional powerhouse, and how do you make the most of working together? And there's NERC is another one, the New England Recycling Council. It's another one of how do we do this together. But it comes down to the question of what's a region? Is it 6 cities? Is it a hub and spoke? Is it like, why stop at New England? I think that the question is this something that we can solve on our own as an individual town, as an individual state? The answer is no. And so what we need to think about is what are the accountability factors of how do we control what is being produced and the burden that puts on our planet, and how do we instead think about really is the path that got us here the same one that's going to get us moving forward? So I think that the time for collaboration is right now, and collaboration means many different things. It means regionalization, it means competitors working together, it means, you know, not having a bifurcated for or against approach, but instead saying enough, we need to really level this one up on a big way. So that's my take, but.
Yeah, I think it's challenging, and I think the smallness of the New England communities makes, you know, adds the challenge, because we have these political boundaries that, you know, home rule is the rule of life and always has been. But I believe if you're going to regionalize anything, solid waste services is one of the easiest ones to do it, as I said in my earlier remarks. You know, I worked in New York State, and everything there is done by counties, and that didn't always make sense, especially if the city was on the, you know, right on the county border. So, you know, we were critical about that. And then you go outside of the Northeast, and a lot of these population centers are just, you know, the scale of them are huge, that they lend themselves to just kind of stick with what they're doing, because they're providing services to so many people at once. So I think it really depends, but, you know, I've seen it, you know, in working in the rest of the country and coming to New England, it's been a challenge, and but I think that's going to change with inflation and the cost increases that we're all facing.
Yes. More questions?
Thank you. I'm Bonnie Christie from the Hopkinton Waste Reduction Committee. This is a much more pedestrian questions for Kevin. If I understood part of what you were saying at lunchtime, you were talking about efficiencies, and instead of having all these different trucks, you know, get everything in one truck. I thought you had a slide that showed for recyclables, you could either have single stream or redemption. In Hopkinton, we've always done source separation. We've understood that that gives us a cleaner and higher revenue producing commodity. I didn't see that. Where does source separation fit into what you were talking about?
Sure. You know, I think with everything else in life, a lot of things are circumstantial, and it does depend on the circumstances. But you know, certainly when it comes to curbside collection, we used to, when I was in Rochester, New York, we collected every material separately, and these trucks became trains, and there was the truck running, and it was like 5 minutes to stop to keep everything separated. It was no longer cost effective to have 8 different streams on a truck when it comes to curbside. And in Maine, most of the material is collected curbside. Even though we have a lot of rural communities, you know, most people live in the population centers, so predominantly it's curbside collection, and that's probably common in other states too, maybe not all. But the bottom line is that curbside basically reduces your collection time to 8 seconds per cart lift. And if you do fully automated. So that's 8 seconds for the trash cart, 8 seconds for the recycling cart. There's nothing more efficient than that. And with a shortage of drivers and fuel and all those other variables that are playing in, that's going to drive it and to be the most efficient system. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule, and you have to look at that. With drop off, it's a little different, because I think you're depending on the consumer to do all those sorts. But if I'm living in a studio apartment because I can't afford anything more than that these days, how many separations can I have in my apartment? So you got to look at that variable as well. I know in Portland they're dealing with that too. We had these drop-off centers in Portland, Maine, that were servicing the multifamily. But the multifamily was the ones that didn't have any space for all these different recyclables. My comment on the redemption is, again, it's a separate sort. We have 2 systems that are running pretty inefficiently. They both have pros and cons. I'd like to see them combined so that we can get the best of both worlds out of both systems.
Bonnie, sorry. So Bonnie, one of the things that we track is equitable access to recycling. So do people have to work harder or pay more to recycle? In communities like the one that I live in Walpole, I drive my trash and I drive my recycling to a center. We count that as as equitable recyclable. I don't have to work hard or pay more to recycle. It works for that. Walpole is able to run a very good program because of all the citizens that separate everything out. So you get that really primo material. And so in that sense, it's not a bad thing at all. Where you start to see that system break down nationally is when the city picks up my trash, but I have to haul my recycling. Immediately the participation rate goes down. That doesn't mean the quality of the recyclables is any less. You're just getting fewer recyclables to start with. And so it becomes a balance of cost. You know, there's a lot of companies out there like, why do communities take all these recyclables and mix it up together? It doesn't make any sense. It makes good financial sense for that 8-second pickup that Kevin mentioned. So I think the thing with, you know, 9,000 different recycling programs is that they're all going to be different. The question then becomes, what is the equitable option for that locale? And there's not one common rubber stamp on it. Could we build a more consistent one so that you can recycle the same thing when you go on vacation? Yes, we have to absolutely work towards that. Thank you, Bonnie, not Carol.
He's Carol. Very Carol.
All right, more questions?
Could you guys talk about glass and we all know the challenges with it, and it doesn't have value. So what is the way forward, and what are the biggest places for improvement, and what are the fastest lowest hanging fruits?
So I think the question was, how do we fix glass when it's so costly for communities to want to send that to market? So when blended values were high and we could base a value of a mixed ton of materials, glass was involved in more recycling. When values went low and Merck started to instead look at what is the value of aluminum versus paper versus glass, the lower value ones had a harder time having an end market. We very regularly see, you know, Merck piles of glass that look a lot like trash piles, right? And so the question is, what do we do with it, and where does that value come? If we're waiting for a free market to apply a value to a material, will it come at a pace of change that we want to wait for? I think that this is where we get to come back to that sweet spot of policy to be able to create a more consistent solution for that. Deposit glass has markets. If we look at MRF glass, which is generally the residue at the back end of a MRF that's all mashed up with caps and everything else, whose job is it to clean up that pile? Is it the MRFs? That doesn't make economic sense to them. Is it the glass beneficiation plant? You know, there's a whole stalemate that's just going on because we are waiting for the value of the material to be the driver for recyclability, when with policy we could establish an eco-modulated fee that allows that value to be injected into the system to make it work. So I think it's a trade-off of, do you want to just sit and wait for a solution, or could we use policy to create consistent solutions? But I bet someone else will say policy too.
Yeah, I'm going to say policy. I just think deposits are the way to go to make sure that you are getting a consistent, clean stream of glass that is going to be pure, that you can know is not going to mess up the furnaces of the glass manufacturers. That's their biggest problem with MRF glass, is that what they get, they cannot be guaranteed that it is of a quality that it's not going to destroy their furnace, which is a huge piece of equipment in how they're making these glass, containers. So we need to see the bottle bill states that haven't modernized and expanded. And I agree that the system has some inefficiencies, and we definitely should address those while we're expanding. But we need to make sure that all glass beverage containers are going through this prudent and effective system. And there's been discussion about, should we just put all glass, including beverages, through an EPR for packaging program? And I don't think that's the right system, because when you're calculating those fees, you're generally doing it on a per ton basis, and then whether that material is readily recyclable or not. So when it comes down to, are these laws going to be good, and are they going to incentivize the right design changes for companies, the fee structure is really what's going to do that with glass, because it's just so heavy. it's really hard for it to come out in a straight EPR for packaging program better than plastic, which is not what we want to see, because glass is infinitely recyclable. When it's managed properly, you can infinitely recycle glass from container to container to container. So I really think we have the solution. It's bottle bills.
And I would just say that, you know, I think the bottle bills have their place. I'm just highly critical that the bottle bills, you know, the efficiency of the bottle bill has not been addressed. And when you look at the environmental footprint of what's going on out there, it's bigger than people think. And what's going to come to it, what's really going to hit this hard is when the handling fee of the bottle bill, which in the state of Maine is now 4.5 cents. When that becomes 10 cents, because of the it's not that these redemption centers are getting rich. It's just that the system is so inefficient and antiquated that they're forced. You're forcing an inefficiency to happen, but nobody wants to touch the bottle bills. So I do think they need correction, and you know, particularly when we look at consumers driving to a redemption center and making a special trip, the carbon footprint of that really throws the whole thing, the benefit out of whack.
So in New Hampshire, we recently passed new solid waste diversion goals. And as Peter mentioned, we haven't had a long-range solid waste plan since 2003, which may or may not be when you were 10, but we're hopeful of having a new one in October 1st. And so one of the things that we're looking at our neighbors. I'm the chair of the New Hampshire Solid Waste Working Group. My name is Karen Eagle. So one of the things we're looking at, of course, is how to divert waste from landfills. And we're looking at our neighbors, and there have been various waste bans that have been put into place. But I'd like some input on this whole chicken and egg sort of problem. Like, if you ban X, is there infrastructure to take X? And if you, until you have the ban, the infrastructure may not develop. You can apply that to food, you can apply it to mattresses, C and D. Does the infrastructure and the thing that's getting recycled sort of develop together? What sort of advice can you give us? Thank you.
I'll take the first crack at it. I think slow and steady is the key message, and that you need to make sure you're not just doing a ban, because a ban alone is not going to work. What I was talking about with that Massachusetts construction and demolition debris, where it's all going to Maine, the problem is if you just ban construction and demolition debris, but you don't have any incentives for reconstruction or deconstruction instead of demolition to make sure what you're tearing down is of a quality where it can be used for new construction, you're essentially just creating a vacuum where you're going to have to find a new solution for that. So the food waste examples, I think, are the clearest. So Vermont is a good example that was slow and steady. Start with, I think it was 2 tons per week. So if you produce 2 tons of food waste per week, the ban applied to you, and there was a geographical footprint associated with that. So 2 tons a week, 30-mile radius, you can no longer send your food waste into a landfill. Because the idea is there's the infrastructure around you, and you're producing a lot of it. You can have a readily available alternative to it. Then maybe you get rid of the geographical footprint. Now it's just 2 tons. And that happens 3 years later, 2 years later. So everyone knows that this is coming. So if you want to get in the composting game, whether you're a hauler or a compost facility or an anaerobic digester, you have the idea that soon there is going to be this influx. And I can capitalize on that by building this infrastructure. So I think it needs to be ratcheted down over time, and you need to assess that it's working. There's a debate in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, they've all done it through regulation. That makes it a lot slower and a lot harder to ratchet down because you need to petition for a rulemaking and prove that you're right. And it's a very arduous process. So I think putting it in regulation, but setting the timeline very long over a period will really help make sure that you're developing the infrastructure, not just paying.
So I used to work for the state of North Carolina, who had used a number of bans, and the clear analysis from studying that is when North Carolina did a PET ban, for example, it is not about how do you regulate that, how do you fine on the other end, it's how do you use that as an opportunity for momentum of what this means for the state. So I've done some work on bans and impacts, and I can connect you with other states. Like Massachusetts has had some bans for a long time. They banned things, but then it didn't turn into anything, right? And so I think it's all about what you do with it. So passing the policy is the first step, only the first step, and then it becomes what it's done. And if you'd like help, I'd be happy to connect.
Well, this has been a jam. Well, this has been a jam-packed hour. Really appreciate our panelists being in the hot seat. And I'm going to see if we can do one last sort of rapid-fire question. And it is, what is one concrete step, perhaps a small step, that everyone here in the audience can take this week to help advance the future of solid waste in their communities?
I think it's very much, I'm thinking about it as the individual of buy what you need and need what you buy, but I would encourage everyone to use your voice. And I'm thinking about the brands and companies who make stuff. They are so attentive to what is the public thinking right now that every time I get an opportunity to encourage people to use their voice, to tell the company that you buy something from why you are happy or unhappy with their packaging choice or their commitment or their something, I think you need, if you can do that today, email their customer service, tweet it out if you're a tweeter, like use your voice, because this is a moment of change and our collective swell has never been as impactful. So I'm going to start with that one.
I think on the flip side of that is to stay engaged with each other. If this is a really complex topic, we've gone through a lot of questions today, they're all interwoven. It seems really impossible. And I know that there's different connotations with the term zero waste, and I said it's a vision, but we really need to continue to work on these issues collectively and have these conversations and figure out how we can move the needle, even if it's just a little bit right now. Because if we all throw our hands up, nothing's going to change.
If I was an effective communicator, you'll know what my answer is. I'm hoping you know where I'm going with this. And you can do this tomorrow. Connect with your officials and tell them you need to increase the fees for landfilling. That is going to make an immediate difference, and it's going to support the higher rungs of the hierarchy.
Keith, Peter, and Kevin, thank you so much for your time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.